this week's episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Grab a seat at the table as Masters rowing coaches Marlene Royal and Rebecca Caro share their biggest secrets on how to unleash your hidden potential and plot a new course for real results on the water and off. Now, on to the show.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Marlene and I were just reflecting that it's been a while since we've been together, but today we have an awesome episode for you about the differences between men and women and whether this impacts your rowing technique and how you row and how you train. But first, Marlene, how have you been?
Good. I know it feels like it's been, well, we had the Easter holiday last week, and then we had our, you did a solo podcast with Duncan. That was awesome. And then we had our Rowing Through Menopause webinar for 3 weeks. So yeah, we've been gone for 5 weeks. It's amazing, but hopefully people will be checking out those other episodes, and we've got more to come.
We certainly have. And I had a lot of fun this morning when I was at an online conference, and I ended up having a chat, believe it or not, with a Faster Masters fan who rows in the Bay Area. So Wendy, hello, you know who you are if you're watching. It's good to have you, see you for the second time in one day. Now, this week's topic came from Irene Tied, who rows out of Ruderclub am Wannsee in Berlin. And she said, I just came home from an erg session with our club trainer, who insists we only begin our upper body swing when our legs are nearly straight. As one of the older women rowers, and I'm also a physiotherapist, put the question to the room, whether any style of rowing isn't perhaps very male focused due to men having relatively stronger arms. And I was wondering whether you and Marlene have ever covered the topic of gender-sensitive technique in rowing. We know more and more now how much theory has left female-specific differences out of the picture. And is this perhaps the case for rowing technique? Should us women row with relatively more focus on the legs, as perhaps they're relatively stronger than men? So what a great question. And no, we've never done an episode on this before. So it made us think, didn't it, Marlene? We had to dive
It's a good question. Well, it's I mean, that's what we're here for, exactly, to talk about such things.
Exactly. And what we like is the fact that there's not always an obvious answer that's super easy. And so we're delighted to be, probing the horizons, I suppose, the boundaries of knowledge. Let's kick in then to the basic differences between the sexes as medically measured, Marlene.
Well, in general, I mean, obviously, everyone has to realize that there can be exceptions to any rule. So I'm going to just, say that out front, and we'll talk about individual differences later on. But, when you look at types of standardized testing for strength, the general difference in strength parameters between men and women is about 15%. So, for example, a very common power test is a standing broad jump. And that's when, there's a line, you put your toes on the line and you do one big jump as far as you can, both feet. Then you measure from the line where your toes were to where your heels are. And a good functional parameter for that is if you can jump your height. And when they compare women's results versus men, okay, for men, they're looking for the male to jump his height. And so the women, they deduct 15% as a standard for that, simply because women just do not tend to naturally have as much power as men. Now, granted, if we had a very weak male and a very well-trained woman, that might not be the case. But we're saying everybody's sort of equal for their age.
Well, that's a great starting point. And I have to say, for myself, I know that I do not show up well personally on things like that test, and I remember doing vertical jump tests, and you had to push your hand up the wall as high as you could. So yes, taking out the extremes, when we get to actually rowing and rowing boats, I believe the approximate difference between men's cruise times and women's cruise times at world best standard is about 10%. And obviously we're looking at really highly trained athletes.
Yes. I think between the 10 to 12%, it's in that range, and I'm sure that somebody out there has the exact figures. But if you compare equal boats to equal boats, right, on the international level, so with that in mind, I think you also have to look at, okay, difference between men and women. Where do they tend to hold their strength? Men tend to have more muscles on their upper body, but they still have very strong legs. And, for women, the assumption is their upper bodies tend to be weaker, but I'm not sure that has to be an assumption, because again, it depends on your level of training. Your upper body may not be necessarily weaker, but there is a proportion of your stroke that is based on the power of your legs, which are your larger muscle groups, and then your body swing, which is your next larger muscle groups. And then, as we know, our arms are a, relatively small percentage of our power. So I think if you look at upper body, is it upper body strength, or is it the ability to use upper body weight? Because that's a huge part of our momentum in the stroke.
Yeah, so being able to put your body mass behind the blade is a skill, and being able to activate individual muscles or groups of muscles is also a skill. And so there's a lot of elements that come together in terms of working out what bits of your musculature you can use successfully.
Now, if we talk about stability versus mobility, this is maybe somewhere where we might see a difference between men and women. Again, generalizations here, because there's always exceptions. But in order to apply that weight to the handle, I mean, if you have a bit less power, you may be more of a finesse rower, right? And be more oriented to finer technique, because if you don't have that just raw horsepower or raw strength, you still have to learn how to move the boat well. And so you may be a bit more technically focused versus somebody who's very, very strong and can get away with some perhaps major flaws, but still move a boat very quickly, simply because they have a really, really strong engine. But in stability versus mobility, this is one area I think that in masters rowers where we can see a difference. Women who are post-menopause are going to experience more laxity in their ligaments and tendons, which can cause some instability in their joints. So it can cause some instability in the shoulders, in the stability of the shoulders, if the tendons and ligaments get a little bit looser. So I think this is something that women after menopause have to pay attention to. Whereas I think as many men get older, they actually need more mobility, not more stability. They need the mobility in their hips. They need mobility in their spines or in their shoulders. Versus women, I think, need to go the opposite. I think they have to make sure everything stays snug and glued together, versus not having the movement, for example, in the hips, because we tend to see in masters men a lot of sitting back on the tailbone, a lot of really posteriorly tilted pelvis, which makes it very hard to hinge at the hip. So I think those are two differences we see as people age.
That's definitely true. And in my coaching, with a new group of novices, we'll sometimes say, and who can keep their legs straight and touch the floor or touch their toes. And, that's usually a good indication of their general mobility, not exclusively, but it gives me a clue as a coach. What am I working with here? You know, who is likely to be able to hinge at the hip and get into the positions that we want in the rowing stroke, and who is less likely to be able to do that. So that's strength, that's changes with age. Moving then on to our rowing technique, I was always told that your arms are about 10% of your total power. And in fact, you can test that if you row on a machine that's got a force curve. Just try rowing legs only, go to legs and backs and leave your arms straight, then row with your arms. And you can see the curve get longer and fatter as you go, basically, through this, adding in another body part. When it comes to technique, we still have some basic principles, don't we?
I absolutely believe so. And with masters, we are still looking at the same sequence of utilizing your larger muscles to your medium muscles to your smaller muscles. I think what Irene wrote is interesting. Just to go back to her message, and she said, our club trainer insisted we only begin our upper body swing when our legs are nearly straight. Now, that's I think his technical preference, because we do see that as a technique, as a style, but I think you also have to bear in mind, if you see elite rowers rowing, you know, that their legs are almost completely down before they start a later body swing, they also have to be very strong, and they have to be very well prepared in their lower back to be able to, you know, to really be able to hinge and swing on that pivot point of their lower back. And I think, in my own opinion, I think that's technique is too extreme for the majority of masters. I think you have to have a little bit more overlap in the body parts versus pretty strict segmentation, because again, it's going to be a little softer on the lower back. There's going to be more blending of the body parts, and in the end, it's about how can you hold the even pressure on the blade the whole time it's in the water, and the pattern that you have to bring in your upper body and your arms can vary a little bit from person to person, depending on your dimensions. If you have a short upper body and extremely long arms, you know, you might have to think about bringing the arms in a little earlier. If you have a very long upper body and short arms, you may have to adjust that pattern. But I think you have to look at how effective is the blade in the water and how horizontal is it for moving the boat.
Yeah, so when I'm teaching beginners, generally speaking, they're not very good at gripping the water. And so actually, when I'm working with very new rowers or ones whose blade work skills are reasonably elementary, I will often encourage them to use most of their legs before they swing their back. Two reasons. They often haven't got the blade buried under the water and gripped until at least half slide. You know, they've bounced out of the front. So you're going to want to use as much leg as you can. Plus, the backswing is something that they can do, but they find it really hard to connect that to the leg drive because they haven't worked out how to activate their glutes. And, you know, the arms are the arms. And so for that reason, you might end up with a stroke that is rather, if you're talking force curves, flatter rather than peaked, because they might have a bit of legs, a bit of a dip, a bit of back, maybe a dip, and then some arms at the end. Often you'll see the curve comes down and then has a bump at the bottom where the arm draw happens. And so because they're inconsistent from one stroke to the next, they can't yet work out the precise sequencing requirements and the overlap that you're describing. And so actually, it's better, I find, to teach them the parts separately or almost separately, because actually you'll make the boat go faster because the blades will be in the water longer if they use their legs before the back. But it is very much about your ability to be consistent and your ability to handle those oars, or the sweep oar or the sculls, in a way that connects them to your, the force that you're applying. As you rightly said earlier, it's about power in the water, isn't it?
Yes. But with your new rowers, they're not going to have the ability at that point to apply a lot of power. So it's very important that they learn the proper sequencing. And, learning basin sequencing, it always, our drills and teaching people, you always have to do some exaggeration drills, because they have to learn where they are in space in the boat and how does this system work. I think if you're working with more experienced athletes, again, this coach may have a very precise reason, stylistic reason why he wants his rowers to row that way. But I think you do have to, working with older athletes, you have to look at, well, how strong are they? Like, does this 65-year-old woman have the ability, the strength in her back to oppose the length of, the strength of the legs to hold the connection? So, again, I think one has to look at slight modifications based on what somebody's physical capabilities are demonstrated as. So
anyone who remembers the Italian national team rowing in the 90s, they had a very distinct leg drive followed by backswing style, and they all rowed the same way, and extremely effective, extremely fast boats, very successful. And it is definitely worth trying some of these things for yourself if you're at all curious. I mean, for myself, teaching that exaggeration exercise that Marlene talked about earlier, you might go out in your boat and do legs only rowing, and then do straight arm rowing, which is just your legs and your back. And then you might try finishing your legs before you swing your back, or blending the end of your leg drive with your back. And equally with the arms. And one of the things that I learned from Alan Campbell, who was the British single sculler back in the day, who was a member of my club, he liked to take the catch with a bent arm. And I thought, he said, no, this is what you want to do. And it helps you get it in early and get an early lock on. So I was like, okay, well, I'll go and try it. So I went out in my single and tried it. And when I took a bent arm catch, as in my arms were straight, but I used my elbows to draw the blade into the water and to grip with the water. When I did that, and then obviously drive with my legs, because that's how you start the stroke, my arms straightened because I couldn't hold a bent arm throughout the stroke.
Well, you know what? I know. Well, there is a little thing about that. I was actually talking to somebody about this yesterday, that the bent arm, what that does when you put the blade in the water, that is another way to stabilize the shoulder instead of the lats. So if somebody isn't really feeling their lats engaged as they place this is where we're talking about keeping shoulder blades firm, drawn, packed shoulder blades down in your pockets, firm on your rib cage. You may see someone using a bent arm when they place the blade in the water, when they put pressure, because that's another way to try to stabilize the shoulder when the lats aren't stabilizing the shoulder. But I think going back to our differences with women, I think with women, you really have to emphasize their posture, because they have more weight in their chest typically. So I think you do have to emphasize them sitting tall, keeping their sternum up, drawing their shoulder blades down firm, because that's what's going to stabilize the shoulders. Because I do think a lot of women need more stability in their shoulders, because as you start to drive and connect to the handle, you've got to hold the shoulders together, putting it in really simple terms. You can't let those shoulders stretch out. Otherwise, you're not bringing the handle with you. So I do think that whole area of working on the lats and that sort of posterior strengthening and staying tall is quite important for women. it's important for men too, but I think women will tend to drop down more. They'll tend to drop down near their thighs more, or they won't sit up as tall when they put the blade in the water sometimes.
And then, so when we're working with men, so you have an immobile older, or a man who is immobile, or any athlete who's immobile, to be honest, how do you get them to have an effective backswing? Because if you can't get the forward swing, how can you activate your back?
It becomes quite limited. I mean, that's I think that's one of the reasons why you have to work on this on land. This is something I think that you have to improve the mobility on land so that it can help you improve your technique in the boat. However, some people can row. There are people who row, internationals, who row with quite an upright technique. They don't row with a lot of body swing, but they're still able to really connect. I mean, if we go back to like Marcel Hacker, very, very vertical style. However, he's still applying, you can still teach someone to apply all their body weight on the handle and the foot stretcher. So I think you have to coach them again where their capabilities are. And if they simply do not have a lot of mobility for the body swing, you have to just teach them the best suspension that you can, because if they learn to use their full body weight, they're going to move the boat well.
Yeah.
And,
rowing with adaptations, as we've said before.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But, if we look at a singles sculling final, we're going to see 6 scullers all rowing idiosyncratically a little bit different. And it's okay to row a little bit differently as long as we're all after the same thing, So, when we're.
Yeah, for single scullers, I definitely agree with that. For crew boats, it's okay to row idiosyncratically as long as your blade parallels are broadly the same and your timing's the same. Otherwise, you're going to be more compromised in terms of boat synchronicity if you can't blend yourself. So all of the things we've been talking about today are useful skills to have if you do row in crew boats, because inevitably you will end up in a boat with someone at some point who rows somewhat differently from you. For whatever reason. It might be physiology, as Marlene says. I have a girl in my crew who has the longest legs and the shortest body, and her shins, she compresses up and it looks like her shins are really like higher than her armpits. She's built that way, and so how do the two of us work out a way of rowing together? And I'll tell you the answer after May the 13th when we have a regatta.
Yeah. Well, but that's true. And that is a skill of becoming a good sculler or a good rower, is especially if you're the more experienced person, you often have to adapt to the people who are less experienced in the crew, because you have more skill to adapt perhaps than a more inexperienced person do. But as a boat, you have to work together and work on the blade work and the power application, and that, you just have to find those meeting points that everyone starts their knees together and everybody comes out of the water at the same time. And, you have to manage how to do that with rigging and different body shapes.
Yeah. So back to Irene, and to wrap up, I believe very firmly that it's worthwhile trying these techniques when a coach is guiding you. Do remember that you won't make instant changes. They will feel odd, and it takes time to embed a new technique. And so if you want to dedicate some time to it, it's really worthwhile. Unless, like me, you found you couldn't hold the bent arms, and it was very quickly evident that wasn't going to be a successful technique for me. So, remember that trying something new may not instantly translate into boat speed. So don't be harsh on yourself by going, oh, well, I looked at my meter and I was going slower and therefore, it's rubbish. Because you can go, there are many ways of moving a boat.
Yes. And I would, just to agree with you and support that, if you are trying something new, consider that a transition and start gradually incorporating that, and pay attention to how you feel. Like if you're starting, and this can happen, for example, if you get a new coach at your club, or you start working with a different coach and they have a little bit realistic approach, You have to pay attention, like, oh, are you getting any soreness in your lower back? Are you getting soreness in your elbow? Just pay attention to any little warning signs that you've got to take it slow and make changes slow and gradual, because you are asking your body to do slightly different patterns than what it's accustomed to doing.
You are so good at giving these great pieces of advice, Marlene. Never forget, look after your body. Thank you, everybody. Until next time. Bye-bye.
We are part of the Rowing Chat Podcast Network. Please tell your rowing friends about the show. And if you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.